Good evening. My name is Chip Redmond. I'm a meteorologist here at K-State and the Kansas Mesonet Manager. We'll give a quick summary of current conditions and then a quick outlook, and hopefully some light in the tunnel of the conditions we've seen across the state. So statewide, temperature-wise, we started the year cooler, which is the orange line compared to the black line, which is our normal. We were average in the spring months, and then in the summer months, we've been above normal for the last 3 months statewide. Now, I know a lot of folks feel like it's been really, really hot. We're not anywhere near the warmest on record. September was giving it a run for its money, but we've kind of cooled off a little bit. And that's to be expected because seasonally we do see temperatures start to trend downward as we get into fall and winter, even with a crazy drought year and really poor conditions for the southeast Kansas. Temperatures are still going to climatologically fall. Climatology is one thing we can rely on. We saw that this morning. We saw temperatures down into the low 50s, upper 40s, and even cooler in some valleys. And that's to be expected. At your freeze, if you look at for a earlier or later freeze, is not necessarily on the table quite yet for the southeast, but we're going to get there, and we're going to eventually see it happen. There's a QR code there in the bottom right. If you open up your phone and scan it with the camera, you can link to these tools on our website. So one other thing that changes as we enter the fall months is wind. We see an average lull in wind in July and August statewide. And as we get into September, October, and November, we see those winds climatologically increase. And that's not a good thing. We've actually seen pretty calm winds, relatively speaking, for the drought over the last few months. And that's been good because it's helped keep what little moisture there really is. It's helped keep it in the topsoil. Unfortunately, in ponds. Unfortunately, as we get into fall, we're going to see more wind events like we saw last week. Just that map at the top left is the evaporative demand index. So basically how much moisture there's been a demand for. And you can see eastern Kansas has been targeted with really dry, warm, windy conditions. And unfortunately, that's likely to continue, if not get worse as we get into the fall months. Now looking at precipitation, we've had some moisture in September. We've already statewide averaged more moisture in September than we saw in August. That's not the climatological norm. But below normal precipitation on the statewide level for the last 3 months, and a lot of that has been targeted at the southeast. And you can see big moisture anomalies in the southeast over the last 30 days. Really no measurable moisture for a lot of folks. As you get further north and west into north central Kansas, we can see that they had above normal moisture, and that's how we're kind of skewing the numbers for September at a statewide level. If we look a little bit closer, here's just Wichita. This was ending last week, but the dashed blue line was the year-to-date precipitation accumulated, and so the dashed blue line is where we're at present day, and the black line is the median, and then the green line is the wettest on record, the wettest year on record, and we were trending right there with a pretty rapid increase in moisture late May. But the tap has been turned off, and we see we've gone from near the record wettest to median if we're lucky. And if you can kind of interpolate out, we really can't fall underneath the 25th percentile, but really dry conditions where we did not get any moisture this summer. Go a little bit further east into Parsons, same story, a little more dramatic even, where you guys average a lot more moisture in that far southeast. And just no moisture really since the end of May, unfortunately. So if we look at those longer term periods over the last 6 months, you can see the same story, a little bit more widespread. And this plot where the red overlays is really where we see the worst drought on the drought monitor. Soil moisture is another way we can look at the current conditions, and this is for Parsons. So the red lines are 5 centimeter, and your blue line there is a 50 centimeter. Notice how they basically plateaued. They've leveled off. They're not decreasing anymore, which is a good sign. You can't get any drier, but a bad sign, meaning drought is in place. And the longer it goes without moisture, the longer we see that flat line, and the worse the drought gets. And that's why we have exceptional drought that was added last week on the drought monitor for the southeast Kansas, and it's going to expand this week on the drought monitor as well. It basically went from a flash drought where we saw rapid degrading conditions in crops to now we're in a long-term drought where what moisture was there in surface water and as well as subsurface soil moisture, we've depleted it. And now we're starting to look into bigger water concerns such as water availability for towns and water supplies in general, and quality too. So if you have a report of some of those things that have been impacting you, please go to this website or scan that QR code, submit those reports. We need that information. You can submit a photo. They're worth 1,000 words, and they help us make better drought decisions because I'm unfortunately not down there today, and I can't travel the state every week. So submit those reports, say what the conditions are near you, and it'll really help us. And think about when we start hopefully getting moisture, this will also be really informative for us because, well, we need to know if you're seeing improving conditions. So the forecast the next 7 days is bad. There's just no way around it. We just do not have moisture in the forecast. This is for the next 7 days for eastern third of the state, eastern half of the state, really. And even in the neighboring states, we're really, really dry. And like I mentioned before, our average precipitations on a downward slide. So right now, if we don't get any rain on a weekly basis, we're getting another inch in the bucket for the Southeast in the negative. So we're rephrase that. We're going negative another inch. And so we just accumulate and keep accumulating these amounts and just huge deficits that are really going to be hard to make up even in a year. So this drought's not unfortunately going to be switched quickly. If we look at what's really driving the big pattern, La Nina and El Nino are common terms. It's all called ENSO. And the observations in July and August were basically below the pink area, which means we're in a La Nina. And we actually saw it strengthen. The August observation isn't on here, but it came out to right about there, right about the 0.8 to almost -1. And the forecast is for that to continue through August, September, October, all the way into November, December, and January. And then we expect it to increase. And as a result, we expect to switch to neutral conditions in the East Pacific. And what that'll do is hopefully break this pattern. We did have this forecasted last year. We didn't see it realized though. And so it's not perfect, but if we look at all these various models, they all trend upward, which is a good thing. We need that. So we have one positive thing in place for us. Unfortunately, we're still going to be under a La Nina conditions for this fall going into winter and strong La Nina. Then because of this, we typically see much higher increased risk of warm conditions as well as much higher increased risk of dry conditions, which is on the right. I know the Southeast division isn't highlighted necessarily in this chart on the right there, but just be aware that really this is when we see our driest falls is with La Nina. We go ahead and I'm going to throw another science term in there. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation has been really blue on the far right there. And when it's really blue, it's really negative, which means we've got basically amplified high pressure off the west coast of the United States. That and La Nina go hand in hand. They amplify each other and as a result make La Nina impacts even more likely. And that's why we've seen such a stagnant dry pattern for a lot of this region. If we look out into October, this is the one model that takes all the other models. We call it an ensemble. On the left is your average temperature forecast anomaly. So all that red is bad. That's warmer than normal temperatures, up to 1 to 2 degrees, potentially even up to 3 degrees for the central United States. On the right is precipitation departures. And just another bullseye of red is bad, right? So not a big change expected as you get into October. Continued warmer and drier conditions. Now, as I mentioned, we're not talking necessarily record heat. Like right now, we're above normal temperatures, but we're not at record heat. And I don't really forecast any record heat for right now. If we look at the Climate Prediction Center outlook, same thing. It agrees very much with that ensemble of models. Above normal temperatures on the left, below normal precipitation on the right for much of the region, or for all of the region. If we look out a little bit further, This is the average for October, November, December, a different model here, but red on the left is still above normal temperature confidence. And then on the right is still below normal precipitation confidence. So really a strong signal of warm and dry conditions as we get all the way through the end of the year. And we're not really seeing any light at the end of the tunnel. So the Climate Prediction Center agrees with that, with above normal temperatures on the left favored and below normal precipitation on the right favored. But, and this is where the but is hopefully end on a good note. We had a crazy volcanic eruption last January. And what that did is that eruption was down here in this time series in the bottom right. And that red square is, you see all that green? Well, that was moisture influx into the stratosphere. And that was a ton of moisture, more moisture than we've seen. And that plot goes back to 2013. So more than we've seen really in the last 10 years. As a result, the southern hemisphere, that's the plot on the left there, the whole globe, has been cooler than normal. It's blue and much cooler than normal. Well, this in turn has led to cooler surface conditions and a more active pattern for the southern hemisphere. When we see a big moisture influx, basically the moisture reflects all the solar radiation out from that's coming into the earth in the southern hemisphere. So it keeps it cooler. When we see that, we tend to see a negative North Atlantic oscillation in the winter following. So this would be our upcoming winter. A negative North Atlantic oscillation means that really fancy word that people love called the polar vortex is typically weaker. Now, weaker might not mean anything to you, but a weaker means that it has more dips and valleys, and that's on the right globe here. You see all these dips. Basically, the jet stream has a lot more kinks in it. It's a lot more active. And when it's a lot more active, we're going to see cold spells. We're also going to see warm spells, but most importantly, those two are going to clash more often over this winter, potentially. As a result of that, we typically see more active weather pattern, and we typically see more precipitation. So we're following that volcanic eruption, and its impacts could potentially drift over and impact our winter. In the models, as you go out January, February, and March, we start to see that. It's not a strong signal yet, but you see Kansas is still a little bit in the red there for temperatures on the left. But we're on that gradient of warmer to near normal, and we're in that gradient somewhere. Same with precipitation. There's a gradient that's kind of over Kansas, where there's a hint of we could see some cooler than normal temperatures, but we could potentially see some more precipitation than what we've seen. Now, granted, we are going into the driest time of the year, so more precipitation is relative. We could get a widespread 1/10 of an inch and probably still be over our monthly averages, or our weekly averages, sorry. So just keep that in mind. We could potentially see some light in the tunnel. And typically when La Nina breaks too, we see a more active spring severe weather season. So hopefully some optimism for everyone. The Climate Prediction Center is on board with that, with equal chances of temperature on the left and then equal chances of precipitation for the January, February, March timeframe. So yay, we're moving the needle in the right direction. And hopefully we can keep that going, and hopefully everyone can stay positive and keep your head up. It's a tough time. Keep in mind, climate is an average of the extremes, right? So an average is really wet, and our average in the middle of really wet and really dry. It's not a realistic thing. So when we flip the needle hard on one side, we tend to get flipped back to the other. Let's hope we don't get all that rain at once, but we can only go the other way. This is the bottom. So stay positive, and thanks for talking to me, or thanks for letting me talk to you. So here's my contact information, and you can hit me on Twitter or Facebook, and then there's our websites as well. Thank you.
Okay, very good. That sound okay back there? Okay. Good evening. My name is Jason Warner. I'm an extension cow-calf specialist in the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry, located on campus in Manhattan, but I have statewide extension programming responsibilities to support our agents and our other specialists located across the state. So it's great to be with you this evening. I'm going to try to be a little bit more positive for the time that I have with you than maybe what that last discussion was about, because we had a really nice win over the Oklahoma Sooners on Saturday night. So I feel pretty good about that. But in all seriousness, no, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to come here this evening, as we all do, because obviously this is a very important issue. We've got some big things that for us as producers we've got to be able to wrestle with and work through over the next coming months. Regardless, I think of what our specific situation is, I think we just have to always be thinking about, when it comes to drought management, thinking forward, and just always be considering how are we going to address those challenges and be strategically planning for the next several months as we go down the road, right? And so I think, just to echo the comments of the previous discussion that Chip had there, was what should we prepare for? And really, I think as we look out forward, we need to go into this with the mindset that the next several months we're going to continue to see some pretty dry conditions, and that's just the reality of what it is, right? But as we know that's the case, we got to be thinking about, as we get into the spring, we're probably going to be dealing with the situation where we're going to have limited soil moisture at that point, and what's our grass green up situation going to be like when we get to that point, right? On the feed side of things, when it comes to individual commodities, when we're looking at things like soy-hull pellets, distillers grains, corn gluten feed, those types of things, that we're unfortunately just in a situation right now where everything is very elevated in terms of price, and so I think we've got to just continue to expect for that to be the way that it is for us going forward, unless we see any major changes on that front. Water, we've had some discussion about that, and I've heard from several of you already here this evening about how that's obviously getting to be an issue, and so we've got to be thinking about what our watering situation is going to be like for managing these cow herds as we go forward. But then on the flip side of it, when we look at the individual prices that we're seeing for feeder calves and also for bred females as well, where's the price point going to be for those females and those subsequent feeder calves as we go down the road too? Because that's a big picture, or a big thing that comes back into the whole picture when we look at the situation. So I guess I would encourage you to be thinking about those types of things as we think about how we're going to be managing these cow herds and the types of decisions that we're going to have to make going forward. Again, that just kind of echoes my last comment there about as we go forward, and we're just looking into a picture now where we've really started to liquidate the cow herd, and we've seen some of the trends that we've had over the last year and a half. Most of the indications in the data out there would suggest that we're going to get back to a cow herd inventory that is pretty close to what we had coming off the last drought cycle back in 2012 to 2016. Most of the economists and folks that put those graphs together would say that based on where we've been over the last 12 months, that's basically where we're headed. And so we can see what that does to our feeder calf price, right? And so I think that if we make the decision that we're going to plan to be in the business for the next several years or long term, we've got to be looking at where these female prices are going to be, and understand that if we go ahead and make the decision to take some females out of production now over the next year and a half, what's the cost or the value of those females going to be when we go back to repopulate and grow that cow herd? So again, things we've just got to keep in mind and be thinking about there. I think the overall goal and the overall theme that we want to really develop here with these meetings that we're going to be having, with the discussion tonight, is just understand that we really just want to be proactive about thinking about our forage management strategies and how that matches with what our cow herd inventory is, and really just be thinking thinking about the whole system, right? And not necessarily get quite so focused and dialed in on one particular piece of what our individual situation is, but just like thinking about the whole system, right? So some really, really important key points when it comes to looking at drought mitigation and drought management strategies. Got to make sure we accurately count for what our herd inventory is and make sure that we're looking at those numbers correctly and truly evaluating what our forage needs are going to be, but then also too looking at what our forage inventory on the backside of that is, and really I really want to emphasize these 2 points because it can be easier said than done, right? And we really got to make sure that we dial in on that close so we make sure that we're making good, accurate decisions for how we're going to set up our system going forward. At the end of the day, we want to go back and look and say, okay, if we're in a situation where, are we cut now? There we go. If we're in a situation where our forage resources for grazing are going to be extremely limited and we're going to have to feed, got to make sure that we're going back and looking at it and making sure that we've got enough harvested forages and other feedstuffs on hand to bridge that gap and get us all the way possibly till the start of the growing season next year or somewhere clear into the middle of the winter. So we just got to make sure that we're calculating that out right and be thinking about those things as we look and assess what we have and what we don't have. We need to make sure that we're considering all of our alternatives and being very flexible and open-minded with what those might be. We're going to have some discussion and we want to make sure that we're thinking about managing shrink and managing feed wastage because those things become very, very important when feed prices become more elevated and feed is scarce when it comes to an inventory standpoint. At the end of the day, when it comes to drought mitigation and drought management, want to make sure that we're being flexible with what our strategies are. We need to make sure that we're remaining calm and having a plan, sticking to that plan, being very, very vigilant, and working that plan and seeing it through. Just a couple of things that I want to point out. From a decision support tool standpoint, we've got a couple of resources that you can access off of our beef extension website, which is ksubbeef.org. One is a forage or hay inventory calculator that you can open up, and what you can do there is assess based on your head count, animal weight, projected days. You can calculate what your forage needs are going to be, and then you can come back and you can balance that with what your supply is. And there's a few different ways that you can do that, but it's a really good tool that we have available to us to just help make a good informed decision there of, okay, what's my current inventory? Where do I stand right now? What are my needs going to be? And you can account for some shrink and account for some loss there as well too, and make sure that we're accounting for those things there. So I would highly encourage you to keep that one in mind. But then also too, we've got another program there that allows you to dive a little bit deeper into a year-round total cow herd budget, and so that one allows you to handle supplementation costs, some breeding expenses, veterinary health expenses, those types of things. So it's really more of a production cost budgeting tool to just look at an annual cow herd expense. But it's another really good resource for you out there as well too. I would encourage you to take a look at. So I think that's what I have for now. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jamie Lynn, and she's going to go through and talk a little bit more in depth on some different things related to forage management. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to her, and we'll keep going.
Thank you. I guess I was remiss. I was thinking everybody, hopefully you all know who I am. So I am Dr. Jamie Lynn Farney, a beef system specialist, housed here at the Southeast Research and Extension Center here in Parsons. So if you don't know or don't recognize, I do have a twang to my voice. I come from drought country. I'm originally from New Mexico. That's actually a picture of what my dad's ranch looked like 10 years ago when they weren't in a drought. Now just imagine what it looks like today. They've had 4 inches of rain this year, is it? So yeah, he's currently running 50 cows on 8 sections. So yeah, I said, I'm giving you the gloom, 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 so maybe you're not quite as thinking you're in as dire straits. Now, when we talk supplementation, that's not really what we're doing during drought. During a drought, during normal feeding, we provide supplements to increase intake of, say, our low-quality forage, or to be able to more efficiently utilize what forage we have. During and in that normal supplementation program, you generally have a crude protein forage less than 7%. Unless you're fescue or brome. Our fescue with some fertility is never less than 7% unless you're putting it up after you took it off for seed production. But normally, we're needing to supplement protein because protein is our #1 limiting ingredient. During a drought, oftentimes, protein is not the most limiting ingredient. It's gonna be energy. Yeah, here we go. Dr. Farney just stabbed you in the heart right there saying that expensive corn's gonna be what you need. But energy is what will be deficient in a drought situation. And oftentimes, we'll have to replace our forage with another higher energy hay or fiber-based energy through corn, soil, something like that. So we really need to change our mindset to extend our grazing or our hay supply by doing substitution. And those of you who bake, how many of you have ever gone and needed baking soda and you didn't have any baking soda? Yeah. Been on Google sitting there going, how do I replace baking soda with something else and still get it accomplished? That's the mindset we're doing with this drought, is we're trying to replace the energy and protein requirements with something that is easier to get a hold of or can help reduce our cost. Now this figure, and this is, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's hard to see even in here, but that's your normal decision tree of what I need to put out when I'm supplementing my cattle. So you go and look at your forage. If it's brown and you've got enough, you might need to put out protein. But if it's green and growing, you might not need to add an extra supplement. If it's brown and, shorter than your ankle, what do you need to provide? You need to provide some energy. You need to provide something. So this decision tree just kind of walks you through that. And I'm sorry we didn't get those printed out for you to take home, but you can reach out to Wendy or any of us on the program, and I will give Wendy a link to this. I am sorry that going in and out on the PA is throwing me off my rhythm a little. But we can get this to you to walk through your decision tree. Now, there's some rules of thumb when you're looking at your supplemental or feeding of cattle. Energy supplements, especially your heavy starch ones, need to be fed daily or every other day. That's just so you don't blow up the rumen and lead to bloat issues, acidosis, founder, list goes on and on and on. So if you're feeding a lot of corn, especially over about 0.4% of that cow's body weight as corn, you gotta feed that every single day. You can maybe stretch it every other day, but it's not like our protein supplementation where we can feed it once a week and your cattle do just fine. So you need to really make sure that your energy supplements feed every day. If you're feeding a protein supplement that's less than 30% crude protein, you could feed it every day. if it's over 30% crude protein, we've actually seen replacement heifer development where, like I said, they fed them once a week and protein, and they did just fine in regards to health. Now, your supplement programs need to be, there's so many. You can pick free choice blocks, free choice liquid, put it in a self-feeder and hope that they do limited access. You can go out and hand feed them. You can get a TMR wagon. You can unroll your hay. List goes on and on and on. And then you tack on all the different companies that have all these wonderful products. It can get daunting deciding what's going to work for you. And I guess because we have so much variety, you can make your own operational objectives work. So we need to develop our supplement programs or feeding programs based on your forage quality. Put in your supplement type, form, your ability for certain delivery methods. And, I bring that up because those big old protein tubs, I like them. They're sure nice. But I personally cannot push one of those 250-pound things out of the bed of the truck. So for me, it's difficult to work out the delivering of that. Now, social behaviors is also something we really need to look into. And this becomes more important, the free choice versus hand feeding discussion, when you're having to provide most of that animal's feed. So essentially, there is, even when we hand feed, they found that 5% of the animals still won't eat or won't eat enough of what you deliver out there, potentially. But in our free choice, a lot of the times we're looking in that close to 20% range will not come and voluntarily consume that self-fed free choice, whatever. And I usually pull those numbers out when I'm talking about our antibiotics in, your CTC for anaplasmosis in the mineral. Why doesn't it work? Well, when 20% don't consume it, it doesn't really work. So, no, like I said, I'm not necessarily telling you one product over another is better. Just be cognizant of those non-eaters in your herd. And, supplementation works out. This is actually what I maybe want to call more substitution in effect. So this is study, they had cows and calves, and they stocked it 2x versus the original stocking rate and fed a supplement. Now, really, to me, the take-home is down here in this bottom row. Total dry matter intake per pair was exactly the same. However, when they were providing the appropriate type of supplement that led to substitution, they were able to reduce the amount of forage intake by half and still had their cows consume it. So that's what, when we're thinking of stretching what we're feeding, that's what we're needing to do if you're limited on your hay or your grass. Okay, now I'm going to switch, you'd think I might be doing a complete turnaround here, jumping right into a topic of nitrates and prussic acid. But how many of you are going to be feeding some form of a forage this year that you've never fed before? Corn stalks, rolled up corn, failed corn silage. You went ahead and baled up something that was probably 85% pigweed. So these are all things, that's just leading it into, those are things that potentially can kill your cattle if we do not have some preparation. And, so most of these forages, there's a lot of forage challenges. In this kind of lighter purple circle in this Venn diagram, these are very common plants that are known to be nitrate accumulators. They're the ones that you could potentially have some nitrate issues, which I'll get into some of the symptoms of that in a little bit. And then here in this yellow is the ones that have prussic acid. And in the middle are the ones that have both nitrate and prussic acid potential. They're your double whammies to potentially kill your cows. Now, I wanted to show this in a Venn diagram because we're even talking about it in the same breath. We often always talk about nitrates and prussic acid in the same breath. Well, nitrates and prussic acid are two different chemicals. Not every plant that has nitrate problems has prussic acid problems, and vice versa. So just because you might have high nitrates in some forage doesn't necessarily mean that you will have high prussic acid. So you just kind of need to know which plant have which potential issues when you determine what samples to submit. So what leads to issues of concern? And for nitrates and prussic acid, both of them, the main reason that we get those high numbers is due to plant stress. And plant stress can come through things like drought, soil or a fertility imbalance, damage to the plant during its growing period, such as hail or frost, etc. Now, you might think, wait a minute, drought-breaking rain, isn't that a good thing? Why is that listed on that list that it could lead to high nitrates and high prussic acid? Well, when the rains came down and the plants come up, change that children's song a little bit, but when they get to really growing rapidly, and plants are amazing things. When they get a little bit of rain, they're going to try and grow and get into a reproductive phase no matter what. So that you get a drought-breaking rain, and they're going to shoot up, and your nitrate numbers are going to skyrocket. And the plants that produce prussic acid, the highest concentration of prussic acid is in those new leaves, those new shoots, that fresh green coming out. So just because it rains, and if you're looking at some of these sorghum varieties, don't think that makes it safe. You got to wait just a little bit of time before grazing them in particular. So what are some of your symptoms? And we have a lot of good publications in here, but I wanted to just bring up two quick things, and we can ask us more on this later, and especially the veterinarian at the end. But if you are concerned whether your cattle died potentially to nitrates or to prussic acid, for say a forage sorghum, if they got into it and had death within 15 minutes to 2 hours after they consumed the product, and you look at their blood and it's bright cherry red, you probably had a prussic acid issue. Nitrates is opposite. They have super dark chocolate colored blood, and it usually takes a little longer time before you see the symptoms of nitrate toxicity. It's not an immediate like prussic acid. Now, one thing we do want to really highlight, and this is some newer information, traditionally, we've had several rules of thumb to help you with prussic acid. And we usually say that after the plant is harvested, is dead, is killed due to a killing frost, etc., prussic acid is no longer a concern. Well, after about 14 days, nearly 75 to 80% of all of the prussic acid goes away in those plants. But you gotta wait those 2 weeks. And so durum, that is the precursor to what makes the cyanide in prussic acid that kills your cattle. This is showing days following a frost in Indiana, out in Colby, and in Garden City. And you can see in most cases, and in most of the other research too, those first 3 days to 7 days after that plant dies is when you're going to have your highest prussic acid. So you really need to make sure to give that plant the chance to dissipate the prussic acid. And that becomes important too if you go to test your forage for prussic acid to see whether it is safe. Don't go out and test the fresh baled hay. Wait 2 weeks, or within 2 weeks when you want to start feeding it, then do your test. That will be able to help tell you what your actual level is. Nitrates, whole different story. The amount of nitrates in that plant is what that plant, or what that hay bale will have forever and ever, amen. So you can test your hays that you suspect of having nitrate issues pretty quickly after you've harvested it. And we're probably past this point, but if you still have something that is a sorghum base or something that is a nitrate accumulator, wait and allow the plant to mature. As you allow it to mature, it decreases in the amount of nitrates. But also raise your cutter bar. And I know you're sitting there going, I gotta get every bit of hay I can get. But if you're worried about nitrates, raise the cutter bar. And most of the Kansas data shows about 8 inches is where you set your cutter bar, and you will reduce your nitrates drastically. And yes, I know I grew some pearl millet at the research station that if I raised my cutter bar 8 inches, I cut 2 inches of pearl millet to make for hay. So that wouldn't have worked very well. But the other thing is if you ensile those high nitrate forages and do a proper insulation, put it up at the right moisture, really get it packed, anaerobic conditions, utilize some of the other tools like inoculants, you can reduce your nitrates 40 to 60%. So that is a good way to help reduce your nitrate concentrations. And once again, I'm going to kind of harp on this timing of testing before feeding. If you're putting something up for silage that you suspect might have high nitrates, wait until after the ensiling process is over. That way you can know what you actually have prior to feeding your cattle. And a lot of the testing facilities they are bombarded right now. So give yourself 2 weeks before you need to feed it from when you send your sample in. So just some little tips to maybe help you with that. Here are our general guidelines, and when you send in your samples, you'll get those, what we consider safe, how to dilute it, who you can feed it to for prussic acid and nitrates. And do not forget water. Nitrates in water can contribute a fairly significant portion to nitrate toxicity. And right now, it might even be more exacerbated because as the pond water goes down, whatever is in there is getting more concentrated. And so, if you think you might have some issues, test your water sources. That could be where you're seeing some problems. So dilution is the solution to nitrate pollution. So any way you can, there's not a whole lot of kids in here, but the kids who are in here, when you're in algebra class, pay attention, because that is something you will use your whole life, how to be able to figure out, I need to feed 50% of this so that it's safe for my cattle. And so that is setting you up for some other health issues in your cattle herd.
All right, thank you very much, Jamie Lynn. I'm Dr. A.J. Tarpoff. I'm a beef extension veterinarian here at Kansas State University. And health concerns following a drought year. Okay, we don't have to look too far into the distant past to realize, yes, we've dealt with drought all over the entire state. Yes, even down here in the southeast Kansas. But there are some things that prelude and are a little bit further down the road that we can have some major issues with. Before I get into that, it got brought up about nitrates in water. If you are hauling water today or will be hauling water this winter to your cows, please do not use old fertilizer tanks. Okay? Even those polyplastic tanks, they absorb nitrates and all they do is leach it out every time you fill it with water. Every year we end up with some type of situation where we end up with dead cows due to nitrate toxicity, but it was from the drinking water that was delivered through an old recycled fertilizer tank. So do want to point that out. Now, health concerns following the drought. This is what I'm thinking of. I tried to set up the scenario. We have limited forage, okay? We have limited protein and energy that these animals are consuming all winter, right? What that means to us is we have a difficulty maintaining body condition. Body condition is fat. Fat stores are what makes the world go round in the beef cattle industry, right? The fat is the big savior for all of us whenever we're trying to maintain these girls during the entire winter, usually during gestation, okay? Growing that fetus during the winter months when we are providing or we are feeding a big chunk of their nutrition is challenging. Right? And what can usually happen is during those later stages of gestation, that body condition starts to tinker down. They get skinny. Skinny cows are bad, okay? And we'll talk about some of those reasons why. And it really comes into my mind, calf health next spring. How many of you are fall calvers or spring calvers? Fall? Both? Spring calver? Yep, we got a little bit mix of everything, right? So either we're going to be dealing with lactation or we're going to be dealing with growing a fetus during the third trimester, which is extremely costly to that cow through all the nutrients that she's consuming. Those are our biggest concerns right now. So that's where my mind leads to. We talked about nitrates, talked about prussic acid, some of the health concerns currently, just trying to get water to some of these cows in these pastures. But my mind starts to think forward in the spring, over winter. We heard from Ship a little bit, if you could, I apologize for some of the audio, but this winter, volatility, okay? Cold temperatures, cold swings. Deal with some calf-sickle issues over the winter, and we're going to be feeding 100% of their energy demands. That's challenging, okay? So when I put this whole scenario into my mind, a couple of things pop out. Number one is vitamin A. How many of you have heard about vitamin A? Do you supplement vitamin A, right? Vitamin A comes from green grass. When's the last time you saw green grass growing around here? Okay. Yeah, it's challenging to come by. If green grass is, we don't have a lot of it right now. That's a major concern. When we run into early neonate health issues and cow issues, okay, it's animals that have been without green grass for about 4 months. The bovine animal is an amazing animal. It can consume all this green grass and it'll store this vitamin A in its liver, and to be able to go through the entire winter months without vitamin A, and it'll just slowly use it up as it needs to. But guess what? It's diminishing returns. Once we hit that 4-month mark, and if they're kind of marginal going into that period of time, boom, vitamin A deficiency. And that can lead to a lot of major issues, okay? Has anybody ever seen vitamin A deficiency in a mature animal or a growing calf? I've seen it a few times at some feed yards where we can get blind calves, they stagger around. It's pretty costly. Now, what I do like to point out is how that newborn calf gets vitamin A. A newborn calf is not out grazing green grass, especially in the middle of winter. They get it all from the mother's milk, the first mother's milk, called colostrum. Okay, the cow itself, she scavenges her body and her own vitamin A stores to be able to provide that vitamin A through colostrum in that first mother's milk. That first consumption of colostrum is where that newborn calf gets the vast majority of their vitamin A to be able to maintain immune status and proper body functions for the first couple months of life. That's how critically important colostrum is on the vitamin A side. Okay, so just keep in mind, 4 months of storage in the cow. We haven't had green grass in a while. That means maybe our cows are a little bit more on the marginal side when it comes to our vitamin A. When we do see issues in herds, on the big herd picture, okay, whenever we start seeing some of these things, that yes, mostly our liver and our serum levels, cows and newborn calves, usually we see issues with newborn calves first. But when we test the cows themselves, they're pretty devoid and pretty deficient as well. Okay, so remember, the calf gets the vitamin A from the mom. If the calf didn't get it, because the mom is devoid, we're gonna have herd-wide issues, okay, with vitamin A. Some of those signs, clinical signs, we think about reduced intake, poor doing, poor immune response. We can go down that list, but what it all adds up to is weak calves. Okay, who's heard of weak calf syndrome? It's kind of a catch-all that we get newborn calves, don't want to get up, don't want to suckle, and they're just kind of dummy calves. More often than not, that's what we see with vitamin A deficiency, but it's also nutrient deficiencies, not just vitamin A, but protein, energy. When we have skinny cows that have been deficient in some of those key nutrients, the big building blocks of life, energy and protein, we can get these dummy calves and these weak calf syndromes as well. So not all of it is vitamin A, but that is pretty indicative. We do have some nutritional deficiencies is when we see some of these in our calves. So the calf survival rate, whenever we have some of these issues where we're having weak calf death issues, almost always do we have they did not get enough in that first mother's milk. Okay, the colostrum is what's key. The colostrum is what is key to be able to get that vitamin A into those calves. So how much do they need? Well, cows need to consume it every day, okay? Just to be able to maintain, to be able to build those body stores, to be able to sustain for long periods of time without green grass. Whenever we talk about supplementation, we talk a little bit about, 30,000 to 50,000 international units. That's what the IU is. So whenever you're reading a supplement tag, if you're reading a supplement tag, a mineral tag, something with supplemental vitamin A, that's providing the daily nutrients for what those animals need on a vitamin A level. Now, I will point out, vitamin A does not have very long shelf life. Okay, so if you've got some old supplement, possibly from last year, or it's been sitting in the shed, let's see, all summer during really hot temperatures, we can get degradation of that vitamin A where it's not actually active inside the body. Okay, so fresh feed, fresh supplement, making sure that we don't keep those long-term storage. We want to buy it, we want to feed it to make sure we get the added, that we still have active ingredient that's inside that supplement, because it will degrade, it will oxidize over time. High nitrates, we just talked about high nitrates in certain feeds. Unfortunately, higher nitrates interfere with the absorption of vitamin A. Okay, so we have multiple factors working against us in the current environment. Okay, so it's good to keep in mind. There are some injection vitamin A products available. Okay, they can be helpful in some circumstances as kind of an emergency scenario. However, it's one big dose, and even for a mature cow, if she's pretty marginal, we can give one injection, and it's like 1.5 million IUs. Is that going to catch her up long term? No. It may only last her about a month. Okay, so if you do have some concerns with the supplementation, there's certain scenarios we may have to use some of those products close around birth to make sure that it's actually getting into the calf. Work with your local veterinarian. There's a lot of different products and combination products to make sure that we're using those appropriately. If you're going to go an injectable route, make sure you talk with your local vet, okay, because there are some options that are available there. But again, deficiencies. If we're marginal now, we're going to be even more deficient if you're a spring calver getting ready to calve in March or February after being on stored forage all winter. Okay, proper supplementation now, maintaining that body condition, maintaining those levels of vitamin A are all critically important carrying over into next year's calf crop. So colostrum, real quick review, it's miracle drug, right? If there's no such thing as a miracle drug in veterinary medicine, I'm a bovine vet, and I'm the first one to admit that. I don't have any magic drugs in my book of goodies, right? Colostrum is about as close as we can get. They need it early, within the 4 to 6 hours of life. Okay, they need enough of it. Okay, but not only enough, there needs to be enough quantity of quality of that colostrum, and that comes through nutrition. Okay, so critically important is the nutrition of the cow throughout gestation to prepare her to provide that colostrum. Now, I've mentioned several times about nutrition and health and how they interact and how the miracle drug of Mother Nature actually is colostrum. Well, what dictates the overall quality and the density of colostrum is body condition score. That's one of the best factors that we have to measure and to really look at how much colostrum, what that density is of that, how many antibodies and pre-made everything that calf needs to get a good start early in life comes down to body condition. On a scale of 1 to 9, where 1 is so skinny that they can't stand up and 9 is so fat they can't fit onto a trailer, okay, we don't see the extremes. We like to live right in the middle, okay? Once we get below body condition score of 5, we start to see a decrease in density of colostrum. When we get some of those 3s and 4s, we start seeing more of those back hips. We can see some of those ribs before the hair comes on in the winter. Right? When we can start seeing count 4 ribs and we start seeing more bony processes and things like that, we will have decreased production of quality of colostrum. Okay? That's where nutrition and health really interacts for the long term. Okay? And just to show lifelong aspects, yeah, they followed the herd and measured failure passive transfer, how much colostrum they actually consumed in a beef herd, and what's the real impact? Well, if they don't get enough, if a newborn calf does not get enough colostrum to have all those adequate nutrients, to have all the immune cells, to be able to have adequate amounts of vitamin A, is it a big deal? Yeah, if they don't get it, well, it's only 3 times more likely to get sick, 6 times more likely to get sick within the first month of life, and we'll talk about what they usually get sick from, 5 times more likely to die, and they weigh less. So, such thing as a miracle drug, it's colostrum, okay? And it carries on later in life, both into the feedlot and if you keep animals for a replacement animal. They just perform less. That first 24 hours of life, the first 4 to 6 hours of life really kind of sets the stage on the wellness and the productivity of that animal. Real quick before I get too far, we talked about weather patterns and how we might have some extremes this winter. Due to your feeding strategies today, are you going to be forced to calve in a different location than what you normally do? Has anybody thought that far yet?
Depends on the water.
Depends on the water. That's what goes through my mind. If we don't have water availability in our typical calving area, are we going to be able to calve there? So be realistic with your own scenario. If you are forced to calve in a different area, be prepared for some of the worst. Okay? We might end up dealing with some of those calfsicles. Maybe they don't have the shelter belt. Okay, maybe they don't have some of the comfort areas that we're accustomed to in our traditional calving area. I throw that out as a warning and kind of a challenge to prepare yourselves for some of those scenarios. And we don't have to get extreme with building big windbreaks and things like that. Boy, it's amazing to park a couple of stock trailers back to back where we can put some hay and some things to block the wind out of the north and west. I mean, we can get creative with things so we can move around a pasture, but be realistic. If your animals are going to be a little bit more exposed going into calving season, be prepared for that, and be prepared to be able to keep them comfortable, but also warm them up to deal with hypothermia. Because how many of you remember, was it 2 Februaries ago? This February we had some cold snap, but the February before that, the negative 30s and things like that. Boy, I used to practice in southern Alberta, Canada, and I don't miss negative 40, and I hope we don't see that this winter, but it's always good to be prepared. Okay? In that first 28 days that we deal with calf issues due to lack of colostrum and possibly consolidated animals over a larger period, we've been feeding all winter and we have a buildup of pathogens, calf foot diarrhea. This is what I worry about. I worry about weak calves and I worry about scours next spring. That's what I'm thinking about today on top of feeding, maintaining, getting water, doing all these things. This is a concern of mine going into next year. And I just want to share those concerns with what this is. And usually it starts with a lack of colostrum. And we have an environmental contamination that builds up over that calving season, leading to some of these early calf issues. We talked about calf prices and how they've been high, they're going to maintain high. We have a shrinking cow herd. We have a drought that there's less animals going to market. We're going to have very high calf prices probably in through next year. It'd be a shame if we lose some early in life to some of these scour issues, okay? Keep in mind, it's not scours, it's not just bacteria. We have viruses, we have protozoa, we have a lot of different things attacking these animals, okay? But they're not foreign invaders. The bugs, the pathogens that cause calf hood scours are carried within our normal herd. They're normal inhabitants. But when we have a breakdown in the protective system is where we run into these issues, okay? Age when they start scouring, our biggest issues are usually viral and protozoal, not bacterial, when we run into some of these calf hood scour issues, okay? Who's heard of crypto? Coronavirus, the bovine coronavirus, rotavirus. Those are the big ones we battle between about a week of age and about 3 weeks of age. That's where we see the vast majority of those scouring issues. And just to share that I'm not just saying that, this is our data from a lot of the calf hood diarrhea panels that they run at the Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. Year in and year out, the trends stay pretty similar. And this past year, this was just put together by Dr. Greg Hanselcheck just this past week on some of the findings. Rotavirus, corona, and rotavirus are kind of our most commonly diagnosed pathogens leading to some of these scour issues. Okay, again, viral. Those viruses move through the herd. Those viruses move through the herd and can infect those animals. And usually it's the latter half, the latter third of those animals that have yet to calve is when we run into the majority of those issues. So I'll leave you with that. Just a few hints and warnings of vitamin A is real. We do need to supplement. Make sure we're maintaining fresh supplement to be able to carry those animals through the winter. That body condition score, energy and protein are king. If we can maintain that energy and protein level of those cows through the winter months, to be able to get that adequate colostrum into those newborn calves, we can greatly reduce the health concerns that I have going into next year. And it's all about this, building suspension. How many of you have the truck that you love to drive through the pasture because it's got a good suspension and it doesn't rattle your kidneys? And then what about the old pickup with the old worn out suspension that every bump that you hit, it kind of throws the entire truck into the ditch? We're trying to build good suspension on those calves. That when our cows are calves, we're trying to build suspension in our herds. So that way when the bumps in the roads happen, we're not getting thrown off track. We feel the little bump, but we can go right over the top and keep rolling forward. So that's the plan getting through the winter. I mean, it's a simple way to think about it, but that's kind of what goes through my mind. I'll turn it back over here to Jason.
All right, thanks, AJ, very good. I wanted to kind of segue into a discussion about limit feeding and how we can apply that type of concept to a feeding situation for both cows and backgrounding cattle. And I think it's a very important discussion for us to have as we think about just managing a limited forage inventory and how we might put together some different nutritional strategies to manage cow herds through this. So just wanted to kind of cover the basics of limit feeding, and I'm sure some of you are probably fairly familiar with limit feeding, but it's one thing that I want to really kind of hone in on from the standpoint of, you know, we talk about it a lot in a feed lot or in a backgrounding lot type of a setting, but it's not something that's always necessarily practiced very frequently when it comes to a typical ranching or cow-calf system. It's just not something that we typically deal with. And so when I use the term limit feeding, we're just talking about feeding a restricted amount of a total intake to an animal, but we're not necessarily restricting any nutrients at all or any one particular component of a diet, okay? So we're just talking about feeding a reduced amount of the total diet diet or the total ration in and of itself. So we're just feeding less total feed that animal would normally consume in a typical situation, right? But limit feeding has been around for quite a while. If you go back and you look at it, and the main reason that it's been around for a long time is because it gives us an improvement in feed efficiency if we can still get the same performance or the same gain, right? And so really when you look at it, it's been utilized at the feedlot level and in a backgrounding yard situation for quite a number of years. And another reason why it's pretty common is because it allows us to handle just a reduction in forage volume. And we just don't have to handle quite so much bulky roughage and bulky forage in that type of a situation. So we can apply those same concepts here when we start thinking about how we're going to set up a program for a mature cow or replacement heifers or, of course, calves after weaning. One of the other important considerations with limit feeding that you want to think about is that you don't have quite as much feed wastage and feed loss and shrink when you go to implement this type of a system. And also at the same time too, which is maybe a little bit more important when we think about setting up a program for a mature set of cows, less feed in, of course, equals less manure output out on the other side, right? And so we can see a reduction there in manure volume, which may have some implications and some benefits for us there as well too. So again, when we talk about limit feeding, right, we're just talking about feeding a limited amount or restricted amount of a very high energy diet or a higher than typical energy ration or diet that we would put together. And we're feeding this with the whole idea or mindset that we're going to achieve the same performance or the same gain, or in the case of a mature cow, we're going to supply the correct and the same amount of metabolizable energy that animal is going to need in order to maintain her body weight, maintain her body condition score, okay? So we're just feeding less total pounds, less total volume, but we're still going to target the same amount of nutrition that we're going to get into that animal. And in most situations, really when you look at limit feeding, we're talking about feeding maybe about 3/4, maybe as low as a half. That's getting a little bit extreme, but you can sure do it. But 3/4 of the amount of feed that animal would normally consume in a typical situation. So again, when you look at limit feeding just in and of itself, just some big key important concepts or things to keep in mind with it. The big thing, right, is just an improvement in feed efficiency as it relates back to a growing calf or a backgrounding animal. Again, that reduced manure output that I mentioned there. We're typically dealing with less total roughage, less total forage, and so that's where, of course, it comes into this discussion here. But I do think one thing that's important, especially when we think about maybe growing some calves on a limit-fed type of a situation, is that if we can utilize or incorporate some sort of byproduct, a corn processing byproduct like gluten feed or distiller's grains, maybe even soy hulls. If you can bring a feed ingredient into the program to go with your other commodities and your other feeds that you have to work with, the digestible fiber that is present in distiller's grains or in gluten feed really gives us a nice advantage and fits into this type of a program very, very well. One thing that I wanted to highlight or show, and I realize this is kind of a busy slide, but this is some work that was done. So Dale Blasi is a colleague of ours at Kansas State in the department, and he's done quite a bit of work with limit feeding over the last several years. And this is a study that he and his graduate students put together here pretty recently. But one thing that we want to talk about with regards to growing and feeding backgrounding calves in a limit-fed type of a situation is how much bunk space do we want to give those animals, because that's an important consideration. And what we did here, what they did in this study is they imposed 4 different treatments to these calves. So they had them at either 10 inches, 15 inches, 20 inches, or 25 inches. And so the whole concept or the whole idea here is that when you limit feed calves, and again, we're talking about just feeding a reduced amount of a ration that's got a little bit less roughage in it than what we would typically feed, we usually would expect, or the idea has always been that we need a little bit more bunk space, right? Because those calves are going to be aggressive and they've got to be able to compete for that feed. And as a result, we've got to make sure that we get that feed delivered correctly and get that in the right manner. Our placement has to be good. But the idea that we typically think is that we need a little bit more bunk space in order to see the same performance there on those animals, right? And this data, and I realize for those of you in the back, it may be a little bit difficult to see, but the one thing that I just want to point out here is that when you look at the body weights on these calves after 58 days on feed, for the most part, they're really pretty similar as we look across those treatments. 566, 572, 580, 572. A little bit of a numerical difference there, but overall the data would say that there's really no statistical difference there that we're able to see there by imposing those different treatments. And when you look at average daily gain across the entire feeding period, maybe a little bit of a numerical advantage there, 1.6, 1.7, 1.9, but then it starts coming back down on the other end. So there's not, the point of this discussion is that there's not a real clear advantage there when we restrict those animals or give them additional bunk space allotment. And so as a result, because we didn't see a real big difference there in terms of average daily gain, you can see they fed those animals in this case, and again, this is to basically just shy of a 5-weight calf starting. You know, they fed those animals just under 10 pounds a head a day of dry matter. And so because our intakes there were similar, the feed efficiencies were similar across all those different situations there as well too, right? So the take-home message really from this data would tell us that we maybe have a little bit more flexibility if we're going to impose a limit-fed type of a situation with growing and backgrounding cattle in terms of what our space requirements would be there when we look at bunk space. So as you think about how you might implement that at your own operation, if that's something that you think might be a good fit for you, I think the data would support that we have a little bit more flexibility there with how much bunk space that we need to give those animals, right? But again, keep in mind that when we limit feed animals, they're going to be a little bit more aggressive. They're going to be hungrier, of course, at that time when we offer that feed. And so we've got to make sure that we've got good facilities and a good setup there in order to be able to manage that really well. Got to get through these, but really when you go back and look at it, our data would suggest that on average, summarizing several trials over the last several years that's been done, we really don't see any adverse effects on health when we look at it implementing a limit feeding type of a program. But the big improvement that we see there is back to the feed efficiency side of it, right? So when we see about not quite a 30% improvement in feed efficiency, the data would say on average when we impose a limit-fed, higher energy type of a ration, again, that's got less roughage in it, as opposed to a more typical ad libitum or let them eat all that they want to eat type of a program that's got a little bit more roughage in it. As an example, when we think about on the calf side of things, some things we might keep in mind when we look at different rations or different diets that we might set up for these animals. When we look at restricting these animals to a greater degree, so as you move from left to right across the screen, we're looking at intake level as a percent of what they would typically eat. So if we restrict those animals down, what we're going to do with those animals is we're going to feed a more energy dense ration, like I mentioned. And so what we see here is we see a reduction in hay inclusion in the diet. We'll see an increase in rolled corn or some sort of concentrate that's going to go into that type of a program. But then this is just an example set of diets, but we see here that we've got an inclusion of a wet corn gluten feed type of a product, again, to bring in some protein and some digestible fiber and some phosphorus as well too, that really fits well into that type of a situation. So this is just an example of what some rations would look like. But again, the whole takeaway with this is that we can get calves to do really, really well, and mature cows as well too, and I'll show that here in just a little bit. But they'll do really well on this type of an approach, and as you can see, we're using quite a bit less hay, quite a bit less roughage in these higher energy diets. But essentially the concept is we're going to just feed that at a programmed rate in order to target the right average daily gain into those animals. So again, when we're thinking about setting it up, We want to be thinking about, generally speaking, less roughage, generally speaking, more concentrate. But again, if we can at all have some sort of a co-product or byproduct feed in there to work as well too, that really fits really well. Wanted to discuss a few things regards to limit feeding of mature cows, and this is something that, generally speaking, we haven't seen a tremendous amount done in the industry over the last 15 to 20 years, but I would say certainly over the last 10 years, there's been a lot more work done in this area, and generally speaking, we've learned a lot more about how we can manage these cows in a limit-fed type of a situation or type of a program. Really, I think the big thing that you got to keep in mind here is that if you're in a situation and you're feeding those animals out on pasture and you're taking them more than 50% of their total diet when they're out there on pasture, that's maybe a good sign or a good indication that you should really be coming back and just taking a limit-fed type of an approach with those animals and considering the other options where you can pen those animals up and feed them a complete ration and manage it that way. At the end of the day, whether or not limit feeding and imposing this type of feeding program on a set of beef cows is economical or not just comes back to the feed price relationship there between hay and other forages and what our other higher energy types of supplements will be. And so there's times where limit feeding is more advantageous from a final cost per head per day standpoint, and there's other times where it's not. It just depends on what the price relationship is between corn, distillers grains, soybean meal, silage, those types of things, and what our price of our hay is. But at the end of the day, it can be done very well. But some key things that I think you got to keep in mind with limit feeding is that you really need to make sure that you're set up well to manage it. If you can mix a ration and mix it well and mix it uniformly and accurately, and you can deliver that to those animals, you've got good facilities, you've got adequate bunk space, and you can do that on a consistent basis and get it done day in and day out, I would say that you're probably a good candidate. Limit feeding is a good fit for you. If one of those pieces of that is missing, then it's probably not necessarily going to be a good fit for you. So it's really one of those programs where you've got to be open-minded to maybe trying something different, but if you've got the equipment and the facilities to do it, and you can manage those cows, it can be a really good fit. Unlike the discussion and the data that I showed regarding feeder calves, I think when it comes to managing mature cows, bunk space is really important. So again, that data would suggest that on feeder calves, we maybe have a little bit more flexibility as far as what bunk space we can do there. But on a mature animal, those cows can get really aggressive. And so I really think that we need to make sure that we've got at least 24 inches per head for a mature cow if she's just by herself. Probably more like 30 to 36 inches per cow if she's got a calf inside. Okay, you really want to make sure that you give plenty of space there and that all of those cows, especially those younger cows, those 2s and 3s, those lighter cows, can get up there and get their share of the ration and make sure everybody has the opportunity to come up and eat. Again, that's one of the key things with limit feeding. Those animals, when we go to deliver that feed, everybody's going to come up all at the same time. So we got to make sure that everybody has adequate places at the table. Again, mentioned there that those animals will typically be discontent and pretty aggressive, but my experience has been over time is that those cows will really settle into a routine very well as long as you're consistent with them. So consistency is key, and just like us, cattle are creatures of habit, and so the more consistent you can be with them day in and day out, they will settle into a routine with a limit-fed program like this, and they'll do just fine on it. Sort cows by age. Again, if you sort them by age, generally speaking, we're going to get them sorted by weight, or those things typically go together. And so if we can do that, that's just going to help ensure that we've got our lighter, younger cows, maybe our more timid cows, segregated in a place where they can get to that feed better, and they'll do better on and not have to compete with those older, more aggressive females. I would suggest that you have an ionophore like rumensin in the diet, unless you've got horses in with those animals, or there's horses around your place and they're pretty valuable for you, okay? So you want to make sure that you're thinking about that. When it comes to grind sizes, I see a pretty wide range there on the forages. Generally speaking, they'll mix and handle better if we can get a little bit smaller or finer grind on them. I would certainly suggest, if we're looking at grinding things like corn stalks, or a coarse or sorghum sedan type of a hay or a cane hay, we kind of work more closer towards like a 3-inch type of a grind, okay? And again, the feed cost thing that I mentioned there. But I'm going to show this here, and what this is I put together just an example of 4 different diets here. And all these diets are set up for a gestating cow going into 3rd trimester. And so what I have here on the far left is a diet of only alfalfa hay. And then I've got a diet that's composed of wet distiller's grains and wheat straw. And then I've got a diet of corn silage, wheat straw, and alfalfa hay. And then I've got a diet there of corn and alfalfa hay as well too. And the slide that actually got into this set here, that's okay though, the concept is still the same. These are dry matter intakes here. So looking at 20 pounds of dry matter, 18, 19, 16 pounds of dry matter for those cows. The as-fed amount is going to be pretty close to about 30 pounds on this distiller's straw type of a diet. But again, the key is that we're using different feedstuffs here with different feeding amounts, and we're targeting the same energy intake or very similar energy intake. So that discussion that Dr. Tarpoff was just talking about, as far as the importance of making sure that we're getting very good, consistent nutrition in those females, and making sure that we're managing body condition score appropriately. Just because we're feeding in this situation some of these animals, and I think this ration over here on the far right, only 16 pounds of dry matter, doesn't mean that we're sacrificing anything at all in terms of the amount of protein and energy that we're getting into that female, right? We're just delivering it to her in a little different package and little different components there. But you can see that there's a pretty wide range in cost per cow per day there, anywhere from, and these are some older numbers here that have got some lower feed prices than what we would see today. But the point of it here is that you can see a pretty wide range in what we might be able to see there, anywhere from 20 to 30 cents a cow a day difference in feed cost by utilizing more of a limit-fed type of an approach versus a higher roughage type of a ration where we're just feeding those animals more total pounds, okay? So a big difference there, and again, it just comes back to what our economics are, but there are some times here where we can see some significant savings in cost per cow per day by feeding less total pounds of roughage and being able to extend and save that roughage out on the other side of things. Another quick thing that we won't talk a whole lot about, probably in addition to this, but there's always a lot of interest and questions about ammoniating, particularly wheat straw, corn stalks, other low quality roughages when we get into drought situations. And ammoniation is something that has been around for a really long time. It's a very proven practice, works very well. But this was some work that our colleague Justin Wagner and his group did. I believe they did this at Hayes. And what they did here is they just looked at feeding cows diets with ammoniated wheat straw, and they treated that wheat straw with either no ammoniation as our base control that we compared it to, 1.5 or 3% by weight. So the typical standard is when we ammoniate wheat straw, we do it at 3% of weight, but we were looking to see if we could get the same performance if we only put on half the amount of anhydrous, if we just do it at 1.5%. And this data would say, and I believe in this study, it was a wheat straw, wet distillers with a rolled Milo type of a diet. But you can see we got really similar performance there in terms of average daily gain and body condition score, not a whole lot of change there. Take-home message from this is if we do decide to maybe look at ammoniation as a tool to increase forage digestibility and help us work with some other lower quality roughage, there's some data would suggest we can do it with about half the rate of what we typically would look at there. So maybe a 1.5% rate would be a way where we can save on some ammoniation, some anhydrous costs, and still get really good performance there. Last couple things I just want to talk about. is looking at our feedstuffs in terms of our cost per unit of energy or cost per unit of protein. So when we think about these supplementation decisions and looking at evaluating these other feedstuffs for how we're going to try to make them fit into our operation, we always want to be thinking about cost per unit of protein or cost per unit of energy. So think about what we're buying that supplement or that feed ingredient for, and what it's supplying for us. So as you can see here, I've got some different feedstuffs there to compare, and so you can see we've got prices there anywhere from for corn, if we just use a price of $280 to $1 a ton, which would be not quite $8 a bushel, and if you tack on some rolling and some milling expense maybe, we can see that how that would compare for a cost per unit of energy relative to distillers. And so as you can see there, if we look at rolled corn at $281 a ton versus if we can maybe buy dried distillers grains for $285 a ton, we can see there that because the data would say that our distillers has got a little bit more energy than corn, if they're priced similarly, that would be, the distillers grains in this situation would be a better buy for us, okay? So the take-home message from this is when we think about where should we put our supplement dollars, how should we go out and purchase those feedstuffs, we really need to be thinking about cost per unit of energy, what are we purchasing it for, what's it going to supply for us, and how we're going to utilize it. And we can do the same thing, of course, with protein as well too. So really important concepts and things that we want to think about and work with there. And that's all I have for now. I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie Lynn. She's got a few more things, and then I think we're going to wrap it up and open it up for questions.
Well, we don't really feed a lot of belled corn here because, yeah, so actually on this nutrient value of felled corn, a lot of values, especially this protein value, is much higher than what traditionally corn stalks, or if you just baled up corn for silage, is. Because, once again, I'm not a plant physiologist, but once that plant matures, it actually puts the corn kernel out, the protein value of the leaf matter goes down. In drought in general, the less growth your plants have, the more protein you have as compared to years where you have a lot of tonnage. So once again, I'm talking about energy is probably our number one limiting nutrient for our livestock. So get your forage tested. The cost of guessing, because you think, well, it's failed corn crop, it's failed poor quality feed, that's not necessarily true. $13.50 investment in knowing what you got out there versus under or overfeeding, it pays very quickly to go ahead and test all your forages. So this was a 30,000 foot view of several different topics that was put together by our beef extension team. And we now wanted to just kind of open the floor for you for any questions. You don't have to only ask us on stuff we presented here. You can ask us anything or that you would like.